Good evening, everyone. Good evening, good evening. It's 7, so we're going to start. We welcome you. Karen and Carol and I are the ones working tonight if you have any questions. And there's plenty of seats. A little bit of housekeeping. If we need to get up, we do have a full house, so if you need to get out of here quickly for whatever reason, this door does work, the door on the main street works. I'm going to ask everybody to turn off their phones and other distracting devices. And the format tonight is going to be, as usual, brief, very brief introduction, and then our guest has the floor. The cookies and cider and books are in the front, and then you can bring your books back here and to get them signed and autographed. So that's how that's going to work. We have an amazingly full calendar of events actually now through July. I have people calling me about September and October. We have Joni Cole has a new book on writing, and she'll be here tomorrow night as one of our new discussion circle meetings, which are 6 o'clock with the author, and it's more informal, and it really is a discussion. We've got lots of poetry, which I've tried to space out, and snowstorm cancellations have not helped, but we do have poetry for the next couple of months. We have a historian, Peter Gould, who's going to be talking about Vermont in the 70s, and we're co-sponsoring that with the Historical Society. That'll be a Thursday night next door. And a young man named Andrew Forceful, he walked out his back door and walked in Vermont, I believe, and walked to the West Coast. It was a walking to listen tour. He had a sign that said, "I'm listening," and he collected people's stories, and really looking forward to that event. We've got Peter Heller, award-winning author. We have Stephen Kiernan. We have Jeffrey Lent. It's going to be an amazing spring. So we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter or visit our website. And also, for those of you who don't already subscribe, the Book Jam blog interviews many of our authors, including our guest tonight. And I learned some interesting things about his reading and thinking influences. So tonight, we are most honored to welcome Brooke Williams to the Norwich Bookstore. And he's going to talk about his memoir, Open Midnight. Brooke divides his time between Wyoming and Utah, except when he spends time in the Upper Valley being associated with Dartmouth, which seems to be happening, luckily, fairly regularly. And he is the author of 4 books, including Half-Lives, Reconciling Work and Wilderness, and a book called Story of My Heart, which is by Richard Jeffries, which he and his wife Terry Tempest Williams rediscovered and had published. His journalistic pieces have appeared in many respected publications, including Outside and the Huffington Post and Orion. And as I said, Open Midnight is a memoir. It's also history, it's adventure, and it's nature writing. And it's his take on how we experience reality and spirituality and the wild. And I found a quote about this book that says it better than I could say, and it's that Brooke demonstrates that real wilderness is where the inner wild meets the outer, and that the bridge between them may be the salvation of our species. So please help me welcome, Brooke Williams.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. I'm just so happy to be here. Terry and I arrived 2 days ago after almost 48 hours on planes and in airports based on delays. And we're all settled in and really happy to be back. This is the 5th year, possibly the last. But this has become part of our life. We have community here, we have great friends. Some of them are here. The O'Briens and the Beaches. In fact, there's John Kerr from Wyoming even, who spends part of his time here with his daughter and his granddaughter now, Rosie Kerr and Rue, right? John watches tourists in Yellowstone so that they don't harass the bears. That's his job. Liza, thank you so much for having me, and I just so appreciate you and your crew here and the great service that independent bookstores are providing us. I've been in a few bookstores since this book came out, and I looked at a map and I feel like I have a great independent bookstore almost all the way across the country a day apart if I ever need to escape Utah because of its political situation. And it's just a great community of friends. It's a great institution, the world of independent books. And in many places, it's kind of the center of thinking. And Moab, a few months ago, I don't know if you had anything here, but there was a Sunday where this event called Writers Resist happened. And I don't know what was going on in the rest of the country, but we, on the Saturday before, decided that we didn't just want to watch what happened, we decided to do something. And we called our independent bookstore, which is Back and Beyond Books in Moab. And the owner, who was even out of town, got right back to us and said, let me see what we can do. And within 24 hours, like 100 people showed up to read and resist. And it became something that was so full of hope and energy amid what we're going through in Washington that I think everybody left energized and activated, and it was very exciting. And I think that can happen in a lot of different places, but we're sure it can happen in independent bookstores, and I just so appreciate the role they play in our lives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this book and read a few things. I love the introduction. Thank you so much, Liza. I really appreciate your reading it so carefully. The two major themes are wilderness and ancestors. I've been an explorer of wilderness and an activist for maybe 30 years of my life. And it's been a major theme in my life. And some of the best moments of my life have occurred in the wilderness. And I've spent a lot of that time in Utah trying to protect the wilderness. We have Bureau of Land Management wilderness there. And how many of you have been to Utah and Red Rock wilderness? Oh, good. A lot of you know what I'm talking about. And it's spectacular. And one of the problems with coming to Dartmouth is I have to miss the spring in the wilderness in Utah, but it's been worth it. So, I mean, it's something for you to pay attention to because there's wild places everywhere. A lot of them back east are protected because they're private. But out west, there's a big surge on thinking that the public lands need to be given back to the states and privatized. And it's just something that would be a disaster for the country. I think it's something that sets America off from other places in the world, that we have these intense, really beautiful public lands all over the West. In Utah, 65% of the land is public. And a lot of people think that's a travesty and it's land that can't be, mined and drilled and cut, and therefore it's not valuable. But I think we're starting to see that it is valuable in ways that no one expected when the Wilderness Act was written back in the 1960s. So it's been a major part of my life, and one of the questions I've asked myself over and over again is, what did Thoreau mean when he said, "In wildness is the preservation of the world"? Because I think if we had a good handle on what that statement meant, it might not be so difficult to protect it. So that's one of the, I don't really mention that question, what did Thoreau mean, but it's something that I've been exploring my whole life, and in this book too. The other theme is ancestors. A few years ago, I had this brilliant idea that I would write a book about the place I lived, which was at the time, we still live in Castle Valley, Utah, which is outside of Moab. We had just moved there. We'd been there about a year, and I loved it. I fell in love with this place. It's so wild. It's the views. I get criticized for putting the very same picture on Facebook almost every night when the sun goes down. It's different every night as far as I'm concerned, but a lot of other people. Do you remember that movie Smoke with Harvey Keitel? It was a movie where every day he went out and took a picture of the front of his smoke shop, and he had albums of them, and he would go through them with his friends and talk about each individual picture of the front of his smoke shop. Well, people accused me the other day of being like Harvey Keitel in Smoke because I take the same picture even though it looks a lot different to me. Anyway, I totally fell in love with this place, everything about it, and I wondered, having no ancestral connection to that place, what would it be like if I went to where my family actually came from? I thought that would be a real interesting book. So the first thing I had to do was find out where my family actually came from. So I called my father, who is a very traditional, serious Mormon. I was too. Somebody the other day reviewed my book and they said that it was a post-Mormon perspective. I like that, being post-Mormon. So my father was so eager to send me my genealogy because it was demonstrated that I was interested in my past. And that Mormons are really good at genealogy. And it's something that as kids we just abhorred because we were supposed to memorize 4 generations back. And so it was easy to get. In fact, I think it was the first package my father ever sent FedEx because he was so excited that I was expressing this interest. So I found out that I came from a lot of places. You've all maybe seen your pedigree chart, which has you on this side and 32 great-great-great-grandparents on this side and a whole bunch in between. That sheet had like 62 ancestors on it, meaning I came from a lot of different places. And I only knew 2 or 3 of them beyond my own parents. Those were the ones that had the faith-promoting stories that every Mormon kid was supposed to learn. So I knew those, but the rest of them, I was astonished to think, had just left the planet without leaving any story behind. So I realized I came from many different places. I had to narrow it down. And I wanted to pick one ancestor and go find out where that person came from and go visit there and see how I felt, and that would be my book. So I had to create some criteria in order to pick one. And I decided that I want to pick an ancestor who had the name Williams, who I'd never heard of before, and who made the choice to leave Europe and come to England. Leave Europe and come to America. So with those 3 criteria in mind, I started looking in the first upper right-hand corner, the first person in the upper right-hand corner of the great-great-great-grandfather-grandparent section was a guy named William Williams. So I thought that was great. He had not only my last name, but his first name was my last name too. So that was perfect. I'd never heard of him before. And he made the choice to leave England and come to America. He was born in 1808 and in a place called Shrewsbury, England. He died in 1863 at a place called the Crossing of the Sweetwater, according to my genealogy sheet. So it's right then I started looking up, trying to figure out how to get to Shrewsbury, England. So there's other themes, minor themes in the book. One of them is that if we think about ourselves as complete individuals, we have both an inner and an outer world. And I thought that this was kind of an airy-fairy idea at first. But as I started to look into it, I realized that I was not alone. There are a lot of people that understand this idea of the inner and outer world. I'll read a little bit. And so I refer to a few of those people in the book. C.A. Meyer gave a speech at the 1984 World Wilderness Conference called Wilderness and the Search for the Soul of Modern Man. It's found in one of his books, The Soul and the Body, Essays on the Theory of Carl Jung. These sentences stood out as if highlighted in bright yellow. The wilderness within would really go wild if we should badly damage the outer wilderness. So let us keep the balance as best we can in order to maintain sanity. I came of age in a wilderness movement among many people who believed that wild places needed protection, whether or not people ever got to see them. I knew what wandering around in wild places did for me mentally, physically, emotionally, but reading Meyer was a real major step towards seeing the connection between wilderness and the direct role it plays in our modern lives. Meyer was a student of Carl Jung. In Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Carl Jung said that while he loved the outer world, exploring the inner world was more exciting and gave his life the most meaning. Jung held that the outer, everyday world is the conscious world, while the unconscious world of dream and shadow and archetype is the inner world. And I'd coupled that idea with the statement Paul Shepard made in his classic book, Nature and Madness, about civilization being a veneer, within which is the core human we all evolved to be. This connection became clearer once I realized that Jung's collective unconscious was not a mystical but a biological phenomenon, and that its archetypes are biological entities subject to natural selection and inherited just as genes are inherited. To me, Shepard and Jung were saying the same thing, although from the different perspectives of biology and psychology, respectively, blurring any line separating the two. Another minor theme is evolution. I graduated in biology from the University of Utah and studied evolution, but it was always kind of inferred that it's something that happened a long time ago, and that we didn't really think about it in terms of what's going on right now. And I think that evolution is dynamic, and although we are creating problems on this planet that we probably don't have time to evolve away from, biologically there are other ways to evolve. Conscious evolution is something that a lot of people are talking about these days. When I discovered that my ancestor came from Shrewsbury, England, the first thing I did was Google Shrewsbury, England. And lo and behold, the first thing that comes up is that that was also Charles Darwin's birthplace. And the next thing I learned was that not only was Charles Darwin born there, but he was born within 10 months of William Williams. And once I got there, I realized that they lived in two completely different classes, and that while they probably were buddies, that's what I wanted to find, I could never prove it. I did find out that Darwin was born in a house that was up on top of the hill. It's called the Mound. His father was one of the richest men in town, and William Williams was born in the Frankwell neighborhood, which was at the bottom of the hill, a 5-minute walk from Darwin's, but it was sort of the slum. So I wanted to I wanted to discover they were buddies. I could not, but I think they were, and I had to kind of make it up, and which was a problem because this amazing woman, Barbara Rass, who's my editor for this book, didn't want to see it till it was finished. And when it was finished, I went to her and I said, I have a problem. I've made up a lot of stuff, but I don't want to call it a novel. I just was overwhelmed by the pressure of being a novelist. I've read so many amazing novels. I just would never want to assume that I could write one. So I made up some stuff, but I didn't want to call it a novel. And she said, Brooke, relax. Just because you imagined it doesn't make it fiction. And I was free, and I loved that idea. But in the book, I'm very clear about where I imagined something and where I didn't. And I'm also clear to say that these things that I imagined, it's possible that they might not have happened, but it's also possible that they might have happened, because nobody knows. If if it did happen and somebody knew about it, I could have probably discovered that. So what I did is I created 2 lines on a piece of paper, and I put marks along those lines. One was for William Williams and one was for Charles Darwin. And those marks were things I actually knew. I knew, for instance, when William Williams was born and when he died. I found out when he got on, and he and his family got on this ship called the Synosure and came to America. I found out a few points along the way based on journals that were kept. And I put them all on this line. And then I found a lot of more points on Charles Darwin's line because he's much better known, and there's amazing histories that have been written about him. In fact, I relied a lot on a pair of books by a woman named Janet Brown, who was the first biographer that had access to all of Charles Darwin's letters. And if you're interested, all those letters are now digitized, and you can find them and actually search them, which is really great. They say that Darwin's biggest family expense in his home throughout his life was postage, because he wrote so many letters. And a lot of them still are available on that website. So anyway, where there was the possibility that these 2 lines would have overlapped, I wrote a story. I made up a story. And it was really interesting. There was some a little bit of magic involved, because I felt like I wasn't really just making it up. I felt like something was going on, and I was just sort of writing down what really happened, as opposed to making it up. I'll read you an example. In early part of William's life, he had a little brother that was born. And I found on his genealogy sheet the exact day that happened. And I had also found a home-published pamphlet on the Darwin family history. And in it, it said that Dr. Darwin liked to treat the poor people in the Frankwell neighborhood for free. So it's not a big stretch to say that maybe William Williams' little brother was having a tough time being born, and they needed to call Dr. Darwin to help out with that. And I also knew that Charles Darwin, as a young boy, liked to travel around with his dad when he went to house calls. And I knew for sure that both of these boys grew up near a river called the Severn, which runs through the middle of Shrewsbury. So I figured these 2 boys could have both been playing by the river at the same time. It's not a big stretch. Charles was silent during the 5-minute walk along the river. At first, Williams thought Charles was conceited, having no desire to talk with someone as poor as he was. William realized later that it was not conceit that made Charles quiet, but that he hated distraction. By the time they reached the river, Charles had pocketed 2 perfect pebbles and 1 feather, gray with bright blue top edge, possibly a jay, and stopped to touch 3 different plants, and looked at 1 set of animal tracks in the mud. William thought they were those of a small dog. Charles said, "Fox." Charles was a thick boy with a big nose and curly brown hair. He was wearing knickers and a white shirt, clothes that, had they been owned by William, would have been worn only to church. He had gray, dreamy eyes that reflected the sky. By contrast, William had a broad chest and was tall for a 10-year-old. He had blonde hair, closer to white, and his mother often commented that his blue eyes were the only color on gray winter days. His hands were thick and cracked from hard work, and his legs were as hard as wood from walking and running. William could count the times he had been in a cart during his life. 4. Rain began to fall. William might have gone home, but his young ego would rather have had Charles be the one to choose dry comfort over a walk by the river. But Charles didn't seem to notice the rain. At the edge of the river, Charles paused, then sunk quietly to his haunches and stared out across the water, dimpled by halfpenny-sized raindrops hitting the surface. Birds floated in the eddy on the far side. "Ducks," William said. Mallards, said Charles. Another theme is the relationship between evolution and the inner world. I learned that evolution, we assume that evolution is like improvement, but it's not necessarily improvement. It's really just adaptation to changing conditions. And that, again, evolution is still working in some form. The writer Meredith Sabini, who's a psychologist at Berkeley, wrote a book called The Earth Has a Soul, the nature writing of Carl Jung. And this book really turned me upside down. The essay that she wrote in the beginning, and then the different excerpts from Jung's work that referred to his passion and his how much he depended on the wild world for his inspiration. In her book, The Earth Has a Soul, the nature writing of Carl Jung, Meredith Sabini, a Jungian psychologist from Berkeley, has compiled pieces of Jung's work and written a brilliant essay to go with them. I didn't realize how important Jung considered his time in the natural wild world. I talked to Dr. Sabini about the connection, I imagine, between biology and psychology, and she said that the core, or inner world, is biological, quote, evolutionary material, she calls it. It holds the entire evolutionary history of our species. She believes that within the collective unconscious can be found all the tools our species has ever needed to save itself. It made sense to Sabini that our inner aligns perfectly with the Earth's core, the wild places civilization has yet to cover or seal off, and while psychologists, yogis, and poets are getting better at finding access to that unconscious evolutionary material, the wilderness, the quiet, wild places where natural systems are still intact and obvious, can be a portal between worlds. Dr. Sabini told me that I was an example of what she and her colleagues had been noticing recently, that people as naive as you are beginning to think about these ideas, she said, suggests that the collective unconscious is rising to the surface in unexpected places. This always happens whenever our species has been in trouble. I took that as a compliment. The surfacing of the collective unconscious when we're in trouble suggests that if we were more comfortable with the collective unconscious and better at accessing it, we would be more likely to be engaged in efforts to save our species rather than in those that threaten us. So, essentially what I've tried to do is describe wilderness as a very important access to the inner world, and that the deeper we go into this inner world, the more we want to contribute to the greater good. I want to try a little experiment here. What I'd like you to do is to all sit up straight and quiet and empty your mind for a second. And then I'm going to give you a little exercise to visualize. Yeah, just take a few deep breaths and quiet your mind as best you can. So in front of you is a door. You walk toward that door and open it toward you. An intense sunlight floods the room you're standing in. It's so bright you can't see anything. As you stand there, your eyes become accustomed to the brightness, and you realize that in front of you is a field, and at the far edge of that field is a figure silhouetted against the sunlight. As you walk toward that figure, you realize that it's one of your ancestors. And your ancestor has a gift for you. Take that gift and thank them, and walk back through the door the way you came. That's good. You're really good at that. Thank you. Lastly, William Williams never made it to Utah. It took me a long time to figure out where he died because the genealogy paper, my pedigree chart said that he died at a place called the Crossing of the Sweetwater. So my father and I went on a little journey to find his death spot, and we realized that the Mormon Trail crosses the Sweetwater River 9 times in 120 miles. So we were sort of out of luck. So I went back to doing some more research, and instead of following my exact line from William Williams to me, I decided to follow the line of one of his other children. He had 8 children. And he was traveling at the time with his youngest son. My great-great-grandfather, his oldest son, had come to Utah in 1855. And I found that one of his daughters married a guy named Schwindeman. And I called my dad and I said, "Didn't we grow up down the road from some people named Schwindeman?" And he said, "Yeah, we did." And I asked him if it was spelled the same, and he said, "Yes, that's how they spelled it." And I said, "Well, it looks like William Williams' daughter married a guy named Schwindeman, Fred Schwindeman." He said, "Oh, because the guy that lived up the road was named Kay, but his brother's name was Fred." So next thing I know is I get a crate of information, because it turns out that Kay Schwindeman's son, David, who actually I knew from school, had really gotten interested in genealogy and collected a lot of information on his ancestors. And it turned out that the youngest son who traveled with William across the ocean and across America, when he was 17, he went to Idaho. He ended up in Idaho, and he lived to a ripe old age. And when he was about 84, his children and grandchildren got together and had him write down his history. So I have a book that's this thick of handwritten, it's photocopied, handwritten history of what happened. And I found out exactly what happened when William Williams died. And it wasn't at a place called The Crossing, it was a place called 3 Crossings of the Sweetwater, which I found on a map. It's now private property. It's beautiful, although it's littered with construction of, I think, uranium mining and processing in southwestern Wyoming, not far from Rock Springs. I never really thought I would find his body there, but I still went there, camped out for a few days, and one day I was just sitting there imagining again, and some other things happened to me. The journals make no mention of any ceremony, marker, or prayer for God to protect and watch over William's body. Assuming it's not too late, I find a rock, longer and wide and light-colored. I tilt it upright, pressing it into the soft ground until it will stand on its own. A few feet away, I find a good spot to sit on the ground against a downed tree. I have a clear view of the wide plain and the stone I've just placed upright. I'm too low to see the river, but from where I sit, it sounds like a huge snake moving across the land. With the sun warming me at a perfect angle, a nap might be nearby. Rio's nose leads him around trotting and intent as if he's on assignment. I watch the clouds and I wonder what birds rustle in the bush behind me. I try dissolving a small pain in my left hip by attacking it with my full attention. I doze and then wake up mid-dream, in which ghost-like Mormons surround me, and oxen pulling wagons still dripping from crossing the Sweetwater River move silently past. Their clothes are worn and ragged. Some walk barefooted. Many limp. They are thin and listless. Transparent children and dogs move past me, silent. A woman turns toward me, nodding acknowledgement through her dark, vacant eyes. William is buried nearby. Of the thousands of weary saints that pass by here, I'll bet that not one turned to the next and said, "Too bad we weren't born 100 years from now. We could have flown." No one imagined flying. Someone in the distance is singing, "Come, come, ye saints, no toil or labor fear, but with joy wend your way." Would I have imagined flying? Out in the future is something we have not yet imagined, something that could save us. How can we begin to imagine what might save us? This could be what William Williams has come back to tell me. Thank you. So Terry, tell us about the ancestor that you saw outside that door.
It did not have a face, Brooke, that
Didn't
I
have a
that I
face?
could. It was still silhouetted when I got there.
Oh wow! What was there any significant gift?
The gift was wrapped, and I was waiting for it to open itself, so it's still wrapped as I walked back through the door.
Okay, keep me posted. Anybody else have an experience with an ancestor? I see some nods. Yes? Yeah, what's your name?
Thea.
Oh, Thea?
Thea, yeah.
Oh, Thea.
Yes. I saw an ancestor and she handed me a paintbrush, like an artist's paintbrush.
Wow. That's interesting. I wonder where that's going to take you. Anyone else? Yes?
She handed me beads from China.
Beads from China? Was it an ancestor that you could name?
I think she's one generation back behind the ones that I knew.
Really? So is there a significance to China?
She might be the one who was a missionary in China, I'm guessing.
Wow. Interesting. Any other questions or comments? I don't know how many of you saw this in the New York Times, but one of the things I've been thinking about a lot when it comes to evolution is that we're still living in bodies that are pretty much unchanged since the Pleistocene, and that maybe some of our problems are related to the fact that we're trying to make these bodies work in a world that's vastly different than the one they were built for. But how many of you have been following the Iceman? They found him in 1991. Did you see this?
I love the Iceman.
I know. This was just in the paper yesterday. So the Iceman is, in a freezer, but they're finding out more and more and more. They've almost figured out exactly what happened to him.
He's 5,300 years old.
5,300 years old. And as for those of you that don't know the story, in 1991 these climbers were in the Alps, and because global warming had warmed up this glacier had melted, and they found this guy, and they thought he was a climber that had died within the last 100 years. Turns out he wasn't. I think he died, like you said, 5,000. What was it?
300 years old.
Yeah, and yeah, they say a fateful day around 3300 BC, so that's about 5,000 years ago. And they found these tools with him, they found these weapons, they found this axe, and they've now figured out what killed him. Somebody shot him from behind with an arrow, with a bow and arrow. And it turned out that he had probably been in a fight earlier that day because he had a massive cut like between his thumb and his finger, and it was just barely starting to heal over. So they figured that he got in a fight, he left, went up in the mountains to get away from whatever.
He left from Italy.
Yeah, from the Italy side.
They got his, they analyzed his last meal.
Yeah,
Figured
they
out
did.
the pollen
They know exactly what he ate
and where
and how
he was
long ago.
going.
Yeah, exactly. But they figured it was just some kind of fight. And I love the last. Oh, here's this picture that they made up. Anyway, one of the scientists that was studying him said, "He is so close to us. He uses the same equipment as we do when he goes to the mountain. Just the materials are different. And we're still killing each other. So maybe there hasn't been so much evolution after all."
But they didn't plunder him. They think there was something about him, either that, because normally they're valuable, very valuable axe and things. They're very surprised they didn't go up to his body and take these valuable things.
You know what this says about that? It
What?
says that
They're
if he was from the same village as his killer, if his killer showed up back at the village with his stuff, they would know that he did it.
But he was high-ranking, they think.
Yeah, yeah, he was old.
And he was old, 45.
For those, that
But
day and
really
age, I was
fit.
pretty old.
Maybe they didn't find him.
Oh, no, they could see him when they shot him.
Yeah. Anyway, that's kind of, I love that story. Anyway, any more? Yeah, Terry.
So that's the evolution part. You've been pretty coy about the interior part.
What happened?
And I know from talking to you enough that I'd love to hear you talk, and you're coy about it in the book too.
Oh,
And I know the experience is deeper than you let on in the book. But I'd love to know, to the best that you can, to experience what your interior wild is, how it resonates inside of you, because I know it doesn't always resonate through language. It resonates through pictures, through images, through other ideas. And I know that's an important part of how you interact with the wild. I think it comes through a little bit through your imagining the stories, right, of William Williams and Darwin. But I'd love just to hear what you feel comfortable talking about in terms of your experience out in the wild. I think it's an important part of how you think humans have related to the wild.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but what I think you're referring to is you want me to just describe kind of what happens to me, and
Yeah. If that's comfortable
and
as
I
you
feel
want.
like I'm one of the luckiest people on the planet that I've been able to spend a lot of time out in wild places by myself, doing only what I need to do, and with my dog. And the book is structured on a year I spent ground truthing maps for the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. And if you're interested, you should go to their website, sua.org, and look at some of the things that they're involved in, and come visit. And if you feel like sending them some money, because it's a real battle. But anyway, the last year I worked for them, I was ground truthing, and I would just take these maps. Maps are made usually from aerial photographs, and you need to look at what's happening on the ground to make sure that map is accurate. And many of you know that a wilderness area, one of the definitions is it can have no roads. So there are a lot of roads on maps that you cannot find on the ground, because they're easier to see from high up in the sky, but they're not being used and they're not being maintained, so they cannot be officially called roads. So that was my job. So I got a lot of time to just wander along these so-called roads, just taking a few photos here and there, but my mind would just kind of take off. And I don't know what it is that happens, but there's a point when you're not talking to your fellow travelers, you're not in an extreme situation where you're just there, that somehow the wilderness outside blends with what's inside, and you feel like you're part of this natural system. You're no longer observing it. I'm no longer outside of it, but you're part of it. And I think it's as close as we come to these Pleistocene ancestors that lived 150,000 years ago, that were exactly as we evolved to be. And I think something happens there, because the anecdotes suggest that people that get time outside by themselves, even not by themselves, are more likely to want to contribute to the greater good. And I feel like that's an evolutionary biological process, and by tapping into that, we want to contribute to this collective good as opposed to our own personal well-being. And there's a lot of people in Washington right now that I think need to spend a couple of months wandering around in wild places. I think it would really help.
Maybe they get lost.
Yeah, maybe they'd get lost or eaten. Good point. I'm not assuming that we're all on the same side of the political aisle, but Another thing Terry might be referring to is some of my more recent inquiry into the subject of awe. And my work at Dartmouth, which, by the way, on the 13th, I'm going to be talking about a Sustainability Solutions Cafe. And a little bit it will be about this book, but a lot of it's about my trying to quantify this relationship between spending time in wild places and wanting to contribute to the greater good. And awe is one connecting piece of that, because I discovered a scientist at Berkeley named Dacher Keltner who has quantified the relationship between experiencing awe and what he calls pro-social behavior. And it becomes a biological survival mechanism. So I think that's really fascinating. And awe, to me, is, it's many different things. Some people are in awe watching Michael Jordan play basketball, and some other people are in awe in their church. But being outside in the wild world is, for me, the most, only the most important, but the most likely place that I would experience that. There are many ways to get into the inner world, but that's what I think awe is doing. It's like tapping in through these layers that civilization has layered upon us, and it stabs through those into this inner place where we all know each other, where we're all part of this greater collective. I like this this frontispiece, I think they call it, by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. Did any of you read her book, When Women Run with Wolves? What is it?
Yeah, Women Run with the Wolves.
Yeah, it's a great book. But she's referring to the wild self as I would refer to the inner world. But she said, the doors to the world of the wild self are few, but precious. If you have a deep scar, that is a door. If you have an old story, that is a door. If you love the sky and water so much you almost cannot bear it, that is a door. If you yearn for a deeper life, a full life, a sane life, that is a door. So I really like that, because it's not saying that being outside in the wild world is the only access, but there are many. Did I even get close to answering your question? Thank you.
She was kind of, wasn't she kind of, she said, I think it was women who run with the wolves.
Yeah, women
She was
who
kind
run
of
with wolves.
saying as though there were certain people who did experience that all more than others, or who had that access rather than others.
There might be, but I also feel like it's about paying attention too. And one thing I've been doing lately is working with the outdoor industry, because so many companies now are convinced that if there's no outdoors, there's no outdoor industry. So they want to put some of their profits into protecting wild places. And what I'm trying to talk to them about is, if you can just encourage people to slow down and pay attention to what's around them, maybe they'll experience a bit of awe that will make them want to do those things that are for the betterment of humanity. Because nowadays, so much of the outdoor industry is based on extreme sports. And there's evidence in the literature to suggest that awe does not happen unless you're in psychological and physical safe space. So you can imagine that if you're hanging off the edge of a cliff and you're wondering if you're going to slip and fall and die, you're not going to experience awe. Did any of you see that movie Meru about those climbers? Some of you did. It's a great movie, and I experienced awe just watching it because there was so much beautiful scenery. But these three guys, they had no time for awe. They were dying or close to it most of the time. And once they got to the top of this peak, they all went like this, not because it was so awesome, but because they were just so glad to be alive. And then they had to hurry right down, or they were going to die because of I don't know what. But so you can see that there's that relationship. So how much would it take just to to pay attention and to consciously say, all right, I'm going to sit here and just watch what happens around me for a little while. How do we provoke awe? It's something I'm thinking a lot about. I think knowing natural history really helps, because then when you learn what creatures are doing, your keys just drop right there. When you learn what creatures are doing, and then you see it happen, you get this little rush of, wow, that's the natural world. I just watched this life force happen in front of me. And there's a certain amount of awe that goes with that. So there's a lot of ways, and I think one of the things I want to work on is sort of a practical guide to how we put more awe in our lives, because I think the world would be better if we can figure that out. Yes?
And it can happen in very small ways.
Exactly.
The other day I came out of the general store in our village, and high up in a tree, singing his heart out, the snowstorm swirling around him was a kite.
Really?
And it was just, I thought, oh, that's hope for you.
Yeah, that's hope for you. That's beautiful.
The other thing I wanted to say to you, you may have an ancestor in Walpole. I have done Iliad OSHA courses with him for many years, and he discovered recently that he is the Earl of Shrewsbury.
Of Shrewsbury?
Yeah,
Wow.
well, in England you say Shrewsbury.
Oh, you do?
But sorry about that.
No.
Sorry, I didn't mean to correct you.
No, that's okay.
I just couldn't bring myself to say Shrewsbury.
So say it for me again. So Shrewsbury. Okay, I will say it Shrewsbury from now
So,
on.
he is the Earl of Shrewsbury.
Wow.
So I'm thinking of Bill Williams, or William Williams, or what his name is. What about the Droit de Seigneur? I mean, he could be related to, you could be related to the Earl of Shrewsbury.
I might be. These people were so poor, though. That's
Why
a,
doesn't that?
doesn't it? Okay,
No,
good,
because
good.
Before this woman got married, the
Yeah.
Earl might have the Droit de Seigneur, you know?
Yeah.
And have her wedding night.
But Williams is a Welsh name, so why don't you go further back?
Well, I'm
Shrewsbury's
trying
over
to.
that
Yeah, there, Shrewsbury's right on the edge.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Shrewsbury.
Shrewsbury's right on the edge. Right on the edge. Shrewsbury. So she's been cringing the whole night. I'm so sorry.
It happens all the time.
Yeah. You know, I bet if we went around the room, we could all talk about an example. Like the other day, we were in Florida, and you've seen pictures of turtles like in the water, but there's like a tree, and there's in the row next to each other. And I was watching these turtles, and I swear none of them really moved to look around. But another turtle started coming toward this log, and without even a signal, all three turtles got up on their legs and moved up the tree to make room for the other turtle. And I thought, that was like a miracle to me. And it's something they probably do every day.
And would people do that?
I don't know. That's the thing. We probably wouldn't. You know?
No, we make just at the end.
Well, thank you so much. It's been really a great pleasure for me to be here and to share this with you and have you share your stuff with me. So thank you so much.
Thank you.